Neighbor really started as that kind of game that felt like a wonder within the gaming community, and it ended up becoming one of those failures that everyone forgot about. Most of all, with the terrible reviews from all the players who actually tried the game. And really, who wouldn't be upset? We had thousands of videos uploaded by YouTubers, which boosted its popularity and, of course, its sales. It had a pretty solid story, the mystery of what the neighbor was hiding behind its basement door, and some very unique mechanics that had everyone hooked. And with such a golden gem in their hands, the studio managed to scare away more than half of their players by delivering an ending like that, mechanics like that, and of course an AI like that. I always believed that Hello Neighbor was going to be a game that will go down in history as something mythical and unique in its category. Just like Five Nights at Freddy's, that game had the mystery of why the animatronics wanted to kill you, a unique gameplay style with a character that could barely move, and a very simple system to understand. Although yeah, I do feel recently they have been milking it a little too much. But wait, I'm really getting off track here. The real question is, why, even though this game had everything on its favor, did it end up as a game buried and forgotten by its whole community? Well then, let's go to the past. The date? September 30 of 2013. Hello Neighbor will be developed by a studio known as Dynamic Pixel, with a huge ambition to create something different from what the market had at that time. And from that day until 2015, they finished their first alpha version of that game. It was accepted into Steam Greenlight and backed by a Kickstarter campaign to raise a generous amount of money, and finally being released to the public with its first alpha. The game actually started off pretty simple. You begin as an ordinary person arriving in a neighborhood with your car, when suddenly you realize that someone is watching you. That person, of course, will become the one who gave this game its name, Hello Neighbor. The whole intrigue of the history was that you had to figure out what was happening inside your neighbor's house, more specifically behind the door to his sheet, since a strange noise were coming from there, like something or someone. And it's funny, I don't know if this game was made in Latin America or something, but instead of calling the police when it's pretty obvious someone has been kidnapped, you just decide to break into the house yourself to see what the noise is. You're like, come on! To reach the goal of entering the basement, you had to find certain tools that helped you solve puzzles, and those puzzles gave you more tools to solve even more puzzles, and those tools solve other puzzles which gave you tools that you need to get even more tools, until finally you could start unlocking all the things blocking the door. And honestly, up until this point, I really admired this version. The music wasn't anything mind-blowing, it sounded something like this. The graphics looked like this, and the mechanics weren't too complex, mostly because of how boogie they were. Even though it couldn't give you the best first-person experience, I actually never played it myself, because back then my computer was some cheap Chinese brand. But still, there was a lot of hype inside a small community because of the mystery and history behind it. And I remember being one of those people leaving my own theories on forum threads and even imagining my own endings. But the point of all of this discussion wasn't about the mechanics, the graphics, or even the music. It was about the ending. Which one of all of those theories could actually be the right one? Even so, in this version, the most you could do was think you had the chance to open the neighbor's basement door, but you never actually got to see what was behind it. Instead, you will always get the same cutscene of the neighbor slamming the door in your face right before you could enter, and then burying you alive. The first time I saw that, I honestly thought it gave no answers at all. Nothing made sense. We didn't know what that noise behind the door really was. Why was there a car sound? What was a real connection with the neighbor? But then I just thought, let's not forget, this was just a simple alpha version and it really wasn't supposed to give us a clear answer. Even so, if you really wanted to dig deeper to figure out what was the ending meant and to see what was behind the shining light, your other option was to dive into the game files, only to face one of the biggest disappointments. Finding out that what was behind it all was just a meaningless PNG of a highway. And I say meaningless because the game ended up building its lore around this simple PNG, where the developers should have started laying the real foundation of the history. Now, another point worth mentioning in this game was how innovative the neighbor's artificial intelligence was supposed to be. And I say innovative because honestly, the mechanics were way too poorly optimized. It was nearly impossible to make progress with the ridiculous amount of bear traps scattered everywhere, plus the absurd number of security cameras that could be installed. Still, compared to other games with enemies that serve a simple role, like chasing you or trying to kill you, Hello Neighbor innovated on that mechanic. Because honestly, if I were a developer, I would also know that if I made my neighbor's movement too predictable, players will get bored quickly after memorizing his patterns. So the neighbor's movement system was actually pretty fun. It worked with an adaptive AI that learned from the player. It could figure out your most visited spots and block your progress by throwing tomatoes at you, setting up cameras, and laying traps. And here's a fun fact. All of this was actually inspired by the series Orphan Black, which gave the game a certain narrative depth that, over time, sadly faded away. Of course, the game had plenty of versions, each one adding more and more features, but honestly, I didn't expect too much from it anyways, since this was still just an Alpha 1, until eventually they released the Alpha 2. And to be honest with you, it was basically just more polished version of the Alpha 1. The house changed, the puzzles changed too, the neighbor's intelligence... well, not too much. But hey, we had some funny bugs that gave us laugh from time to time. Still, just like the Alpha 1, where all the dilemmas around the basement, dreams, hiding spot, and the simple house came into play, Alpha 2 pushed things further, adding more tension to the neighbor's chases, that terrifying effect of him getting closer, speeding up, and of course, a much better soundtrack playing while he was after you. The big difference between these two versions was the ending. In the first one, we were buried alive, for example, but here in the Alpha 2, I think they finally gave us some hints about what was actually inside the basement. Once you managed to open the door, it led you into a very strange, almost eerie hallway where you will find a makeshift bed, several posters on the walls, and finally a game completed screen. And that moment when I saw this ending, my brain exploded. This was a huge step toward discovering what the neighbor was hiding, and it opened up a new mystery. Who is that person? What are those stains on the walls? What does this have to do with the previous ending? Everyone was really hyped for the Alpha 3. The secrets and the final version of the game felt very closer than ever, and then it finally came out. What the hell is this? Remember the nice house from the previous Alpha where it felt a normal person actually lived there? Well, they decided to transform it into the weird mashup of all the earlier versions, making it look more like some abstract piece of art of a museum. The first new thing in this version was that there was plenty of content to keep you entertained for hours and hours. We got the new abilities like the hiding while crouch, double jumping, and even being able to push the neighbor when he caught you. This really gave us a new way to enjoy the game, and honestly, I will say this alpha was one of the best versions the game ever gave us. But I also feel instead of an update, it was more a downgrade. For example, take the ability who let you push the neighbor when he caught you. In this mission, your goal was to move through the course without getting caught by mannequins. To do that, you had to hide inside a locker every time you hear a bell. Sounds simple, right? In theory, it should have been quick to complete, but it seems like the developers forgot the most important part of a mechanic. The lockers were supposed to actually protect you. Instead, the mannequins could still catch you instantly even if you were hiding inside. This book made the minigame extremely frustrating, and it wasn't just that, there were other issues in the rest of the minigames too, like the terrible interaction with items in the shopping market, and the paper plane in the double jumping minigame. And let's not forget that the checkpoints in these minigames were practically non-existent, which means that if for any reason you die, you had to start everything all over again from the very beginning. Now, if we take out the minigames and focus directly on the puzzles around the neighbor's house, honestly, they weren't in much better shape either. The neighbor would constantly do strange things, most objects didn't work the way they were supposed to, and the best part of all, the items you actually needed to keep progression could just disappear for no reason. Or worse, the game simply wouldn't save your progress. And look, don't get me wrong, I love when a game gives me plenty of things to do. I like solving puzzles, I like flying around with my umbrella, and I love being able to cross the map using books discovered by the community. But I remember moments in the game when I asked myself, why are there so many cameras at the entrance? Why is the neighbor, the main mechanic by the way, stuck back inside a door? And why I'm more focused on mannequins instead of feeling the tension being chased by the neighbor? The game is called Hello Neighbor. I want to play against the neighbor. I know I'm being pretty harsh on this version. After all, the game was still an alpha. That meant we still had several releases ahead before we could really judge whether this was going to be a good game or a bad one. And believe me, that was my biggest mistake. That thought that the game could still improve was also with me during the Alpha 4, where honestly they did practically the same thing as in the Alpha 2. In other words, they just took the previous version, fixed it up a little bit, polished it here and there, and released it to the public. I think while the game did improve many of its buggy mechanics and the neighbor finally seemed more interested in you, it still wasn't worthy of being called anything close to a final version. And I won't drag out the betas because beta 1, 2 and 3 were basically just the developers realizing that the mechanics they had to try to add, they actually had to polish them one by one and little by little. The truth is, at this point it was already clear that they only had two choices. Either for the final game they would polish the details, fix the bugs, fix the minigames, and most importantly, make the neighbor actually intelligent and create an absolutely masterpiece that will go down in history, or they could keep expanding the game without polishing anything and let it fall straight into the bankruptcy. And that's when Dynamic Pixel broke into the same person who had been working on Disney movies to make what they thought was the wisest decision ever made. At last, the day arrived, the final version of Hello Neighbor. All of those years of lessons learned, all of those years of endings that made less and less sense, years of suffering through bad neighbors programming and poorly designed minigames. Now, let's see what they actually delivered. It's just the same alpha as we already had, but releasing what developers decide to call acts. In truth, the final game was nothing more than a more defined version of all the previous builds. You went through a stage, starting as a kid, then growing into an adult, while going through all the minigames, unlocking abilities, and of course, being chased by the neighbor as he tried to catch you before you could escape, or uncover the truth behind the basement. I have to admit, the potential this game had was infinite, and I can't complain about how they planted the mystery, leaving us with questions like, Who were the people on the missing posters? Who is really behind the basement door? Why is the neighbor always crying when you are not looking? And who exactly are we in this history? As an extra, the game really did give us innovative ideas, useful abilities to keep moving forward, and honestly, many hours of entertainment thanks to the sheer amount of puzzles and Easter eggs you could find. But then, if we just look a little closer at the reviews, they weren't very positive about the game at all. And without doubt, the main reason of its failure was that the final version of the game wasn't even close to be finished. The minigames, once again, weren't even well structured. If you wanted to beat them, it wasn't a matter of skill or knowing how to play, it was pure luck. Luck that the enemies and objects would actually collide the right way so you could move on. And seriously, do you really think this is a good final version of the neighbor? He looks more like a Fortnite NPC. I know, I probably sound way too critical, just pointing out the bad stuff, and yeah, there is probably already someone in the comments saying I don't have a high enough IQ to understand the history, but seriously, if you have already written that comment, please go to Steam, buy the game, play it just for 15 minutes, and you will already find some book item or more than 10,000 cameras just at the neighbor entrance. And after so many years of development, trial and error, you really can't call this a proper final version of a game. If Cyberpunk could release in such broken state that it had to be pulled from the stores and then turn it into a masterpiece, I don't think Dynamic Pixels had it hard. I'm not saying Hello Neighbor was unplayable. At the end of the day, there were plenty of other things to focus on if you look past the absolute number of bugs. As an idea, it's a game with a strong history. It was truly promising. Tons of people were dying to uncover the secrets behind that basement door, so much so that nobody really cared at the first that the game was poorly developed. But honestly, I think the way they handled the timeline of the history was a complete mess. And I don't say that just because I didn't like it or I didn't get it. It's because with so many clues and codices changing from version to version, it really felt like the developers themselves didn't know how they wanted the history to end. At first, the whole community thought what was behind the door was the neighbor's son, since in most endings you could see toys and a small bed. Hey guys, this is Latino from the future. I just want to make it clear that the video is only about Hello Neighbor and not its future versions. Those games like hide and seek came later and explained the history much more clearly, so I'm not referring to that here. Now with that said, let's get back to the video. Later on, in other versions, it was shown that behind the door was actually a shadow implied to be the neighbor's wife. And then, surprisingly, in the final version of the game, where everyone expected answers to all the mystery built up over the years, they gave us this. The neighbor was some kind of a giant snail with the shell as a house. And your goal was to waken it enough to enter the house, only to get yet another cutscene showing the same shadow tormenting the neighbor again. Sure, a lot of people managed to give their own interpretations, and believe me, I was one of those who sat through 30 minutes videos explaining all the endings, just to realize that the developers had created an absolutely terrible ending for such a highly anticipated game. And honestly, it makes me sad. It makes me sad to see that a game which was once so acclaimed and famous ended up being a game that wasn't really fun unless you were watching a streamer or YouTuber loving of how many times they had to repeat a minigame because of how broken it was.
Pero vamos a ver!
It didn't leave behind a history or gameplay that I will actually miss, and the numbers themselves prove it. The game had a ton of potential that was completely wasted due to the poor development. And really, it all came down to the fact that they just decided to squeeze every last drop of money out of it. Instead of polishing the game or making smart changes, they chose to keep milking its fame. Hello Neighbor Hide and Seek gave us a slightly better concept of what the history was supposed to be, but it was still badly developed. Secret Neighbor was a failed attempt of making a multiplayer game similar to Dead by Daylight, Hello Engineer, which I never tried, and Hello Neighbor 2 and 3, which honestly had nothing to do with the original Hello Neighbor, just a cash grab from the company. And believe me, if it wasn't for making this video, I probably wouldn't even know these games existed. The original game had one of those golden opportunities you almost never see in this type of games. Big YouTubers play it, millions of people were excited for future versions, countless community were speculating about the secret behind the basement door, and the enemy itself seemed really promising with deeper symbolism, like family trauma and childhood fears. And to be fair, the developers really were putting effort little by little to the final product, but they stretched it way too far, to the point of losing track of their own success, an unfinished ending, frustrating bugs, and an enemy that ultimately didn't have much to offer. Hello Neighbor was that game that could have gone down in history as something truly iconic, but bad decisions dragged it into the oblivion, leaving it as deep down as a game can possibly go. A very sad ending for what could have been a great game. But my last conclusion will always be, have you tried the arepas? They are amazing!
素敵な夢を見たのそれは私の素敵な星さ